I stood frozen in the middle of my sheep pen, my hand trembling as I held the feed bag containing some suspicious white powder. My 3 champion sheep lay motionless on the ground before me, and just beyond the fence Karen was smiling. That smile, plastered across her face like she'd just won first place at the county fair's pie-baking contest, made my blood run cold. If you're reading this from your suburban home with an HOA, you might want to check your bylaws after this story. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I'm genuinely curious how many of you have dealt with HOA nightmares like mine. The morning had started like any other. I'd woken up at dawn, made my coffee, and headed out to tend to my prized Valais black-nosed sheep. 3 magnificent creatures I'd imported from Switzerland after years of research and saving. They were my pride and joy, champions in their breeding class, and frankly more valuable than Karen's luxury SUV she loved to polish every Sunday while glaring at my property. These weren't just any sheep. They were the equivalent of having Westminster Dog Show winners in your backyard. Expensive, rare, and according to Karen, disgustingly noisy farm animals that don't belong in a civilized neighborhood. When I approached the pen that morning, I immediately knew something was wrong. The usual chorus of bleats that greeted me was eerily absent. Instead, I found all 3 of my sheep, Zeus, Apollo, and Hermes, lying on their sides, barely breathing. Near the feeding trough was a bag of feed that looked almost identical to my usual brand, except for a slightly different texture and a faint chemical smell that made my nose burn. My security camera had captured blurry footage of someone entering my property at 3 a.m., but the figure was wearing a hoodie pulled low over their face. Still, those distinctive flower masculine Crocs, leaving imprints in the soft earth by the gate, were unmistakable. Only one person in our neighborhood paraded around in those gaudy monstrosities. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone to call the veterinarian, then the police. As I waited, I noticed Karen peering over her fence, pretending to water her immaculate row of hydrangeas while stealing glances at my distress. When our eyes met, she didn't even have the decency to look away. Instead, she smiled that smug smile that said, "I warned you about those noisy animals." I wanted to confront her right then and there, to storm over and demand answers, but something inside me, perhaps the same instinct that had kept me documenting every interaction with her for the past year, told me to wait, to play the long game. You see, Karen thought she'd won. She thought she'd finally forced my hand, that I'd have no choice but to give up my beloved sheep after this unfortunate accident. What she didn't know was that I had something more powerful than security camera footage, an insurance policy that she herself had forced me to sign. Sometimes the best revenge isn't served hot and angry. It's served cold, calculated, and wrapped in legal documentation that your opponent never bothered to read. 18 months earlier, I had moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oak Ridge Estates after spending 20 years in downtown Chicago. I was burnt out from corporate law and looking for a slower pace of life. A place where I could pursue my passion for rare livestock breeding without the constraints of city living. The transition hadn't been easy. 2 decades of high-pressure litigation had left me with a permanent furrow between my eyebrows and a collection of designer suits that suddenly had nowhere to go. My colleagues had thrown me a retirement party that felt more like a funeral, complete with speeches about my distinguished career and invaluable contributions to the firm. Truth be told, I couldn't wait to leave it all behind. The 80-hour weeks, the cutthroat competition, the constant stress of navigating legal minefields for clients who rarely appreciated the work. My interest in rare sheep breeds had started as a stress-relieving hobby during my law career. Weekend trips to agricultural shows and late nights researching bloodlines had been my escape from briefs and depositions. There was something profoundly calming about these gentle creatures, their rhythmic chewing, their soft bleats, the way they followed established patterns and hierarchies without the deception and manipulation so common in human interactions. I'd started with books and online forums, then progressed to visiting farms and attending livestock auctions. By the time I left Chicago, I had detailed breeding plans and connections with sheep breeders across 3 continents. What had begun as a curiosity had evolved into a genuine passion, complete with certification in livestock management and membership in several international breeding associations. Oak Ridge seemed perfect. Spacious lots, reasonable distance between houses, and bylaws that, while restricting certain activities, did allow for small livestock in limited numbers if properly maintained. The real estate agent had shown me satellite views of the neighborhood, pointing out the generous backyards and the greenbelt that ran behind several properties, including the one I was considering. "Perfect for your sheep," she had assured me, pulling up the relevant section of the HOA bylaws on her tablet. "See here, small livestock permitted with proper housing and care. You'll just need approval for the enclosure itself, which is standard procedure." I'd done my research before purchasing, or so I thought. What the real estate agent conveniently failed to mention was that the HOA was effectively run by one person, Karen Westfield, a 50-something former sales executive who had channeled all her Type A personality and corporate ruthlessness into maintaining what she called the perfect neighborhood aesthetic. Karen had been president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association for 8 consecutive years, running unopposed because most residents were too intimidated or apathetic to challenge her. Her garden won awards, her holiday decorations were featured in local magazines, and her knowledge of the HOA bylaws was so extensive that she could quote specific subsections from memory. Our first encounter happened 3 days after I moved in. The morning had started pleasantly enough. Birds singing, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of blooming magnolias from a neighbor's yard, and the satisfying progress of unpacking my library into the custom shelves that lined my new home office. I had just finished arranging my collection of legal textbooks and rare books on livestock breeding when the doorbell rang, followed immediately by a sharp, persistent knocking that suggested whoever was outside wasn't accustomed to waiting. I opened the door to find a woman in her early 50s with expertly highlighted blonde hair cut into a precise bob that didn't move even in the breeze. She wore tailored khaki pants, a crisp white button-down shirt, and a navy cardigan draped over her shoulders in a way that looked simultaneously casual and calculated. Her makeup was flawless, though applied with a heavier hand than was strictly necessary for a morning visit to a new neighbor. Everything about her appearance communicated careful curation and attention to detail. There stood Karen, clutching a thick binder labeled Oak Ridge Estates Welcome Package in one hand and a basket of muffins in the other. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she introduced herself, reminding me of opposing counsel preparing to spring a trap in cross-examination. "Welcome to Oak Ridge. I'm Karen Westfield, HOA President. I like to personally deliver our community guidelines to each new resident." She thrust the binder into my hands with more force than necessary for something allegedly welcoming, nearly causing me to step backward. The binder was hefty, at least 3 inches thick and professionally printed, with color-coded tabs and a laminated cover featuring a stock photo of perfect suburban homes nestled among manicured trees. "I noticed you're installing fencing in the back. I hope you've submitted the proper forms for approval." Her tone made it clear this wasn't a question, but a veiled accusation. I explained that I had indeed submitted the paperwork and received preliminary approval for both the fencing and the small shelter I planned to build for my soon-to-arrive sheep. I even retrieved the approval email from my phone and showed it to her, along with the confirmation number and the name of the committee member who had reviewed my application. I'd spent enough years dealing with difficult clients and opposing counsel to recognize when documentation would be necessary. At the mention of the word sheep, Karen's practiced smile vanished so quickly it was as if someone had flipped a switch. Her expression transformed into one of complete horror, as if I'd announced plans to open a toxic waste dump or start a motorcycle repair shop in my living room. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat in a gesture so theatrical it would have seemed excessive on a daytime soap opera. "Sheep? No one said anything about livestock. This is a residential neighborhood, not a farm." The last word was enunciated with such disgust that spittle formed at the corner of her mouth, which she quickly dabbed away with a monogrammed handkerchief she produced from her pocket. I maintained the calm demeanor that had served me well during contentious negotiations, smiling pleasantly as I reached for the binder she had just given me. Turning to a tabbed section labeled Permitted and Prohibited Property Uses, I calmly showed her the relevant section in the HOA bylaws that allowed for small livestock in limited numbers. The language was quite specific, permitting up to 3 small livestock animals on lots exceeding 1/2 acre when properly housed in approved structures and maintained in sanitary conditions. I pointed out that my 3 sheep would be well within these restrictions and that my property was actually 0.75 acres, significantly larger than the minimum requirement. Karen's face tightened as she realized I'd done my homework. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and I could almost see her recalculating her approach. She closed the binder with a snap and took a step back, surveying me as if seeing me for the first time. "I wasn't aware you were familiar with HOA regulations," she said, her tone suggesting this knowledge somehow made me suspicious. I smiled and mentioned my background in corporate law, which caused another flicker of reassessment to cross her features. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with forced politeness that barely masked her displeasure, "I don't care if your sheep have royal bloodlines or come from some European country. If they make noise, I'll call the police. Some of us moved to Oak Ridge for peace and quiet, not to live next to a petting zoo." The sheep arrived 2 weeks later after months of coordination with breeders in Switzerland and navigating the complex import regulations for livestock. The process had cost nearly as much as my first year's salary as an attorney, but the moment the transport van pulled into my driveway and I caught my first glimpse of them, I knew it had been worth every penny. 3 beautiful Valais black-nosed lambs emerged from their travel crates, looking like stuffed animals come to life, with their distinctive black faces and spiral horns contrasting against their impossibly fluffy white wool. Zeus, the largest male, had an impressive set of curled horns and a dignified bearing that immediately established him as the leader. Apollo, slightly smaller but with the most perfect facial markings according to breed standards, moved with grace and curiosity. Hermes, the youngest and smallest, had an endearing playfulness that made him immediately approachable. The breed was known for its docile temperament and striking appearance, often called the cutest sheep in the world by enthusiasts. Originally from the Valais region of Switzerland, these sheep had been carefully bred for centuries, valued for both their wool and meat, though I had no intention of using mine for the latter. My interest was purely in breeding and showing these magnificent animals, preserving their lineage and perhaps eventually establishing my own recognized bloodline. They were gentle, friendly, and yes, occasionally they bleated. Not excessively, not at night, just normal sheep communication during daylight hours. Their vocalizations were actually quite moderate compared to many other farm animals, nothing like the piercing calls of peacocks or the constant clucking of chickens. I had specifically chosen this breed partly for their relatively quiet nature, knowing I would be keeping them in a residential area. Most neighbors who passed by during walks would stop to admire them, often bringing children who delighted in feeding the friendly animals handfuls of approved treats through the fence. Karen, however, seemed to have exceptional hearing when it came to my sheep. By the end of their first week in residence, I found a formal warning letter taped to my mailbox. Not mailed, not placed inside, but taped to the outside where any passing neighbor could see it, the bright red violation notice header visible from several feet away. The letter, printed on official HOA letterhead with the Oak Ridge Estates logo embossed at the top, cited, "Excessive animal noise disrupting the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood." The language was coldly bureaucratic but contained unmistakable notes of Karen's personal vendetta, particularly in the detailed specification of disturbances during morning meditation and yoga hours, 6-8 a.m. A time frame I would later learn had been created specifically for this complaint and appeared nowhere else in the HOA guidelines. The letter was signed by Karen in her official HOA president capacity, with a flourish that took up nearly a quarter of the page. Rather than engaging in what would surely be a fruitless confrontation, I nodded politely when I saw her watching me read the letter from her porch. I didn't argue or defend myself. I simply took the letter inside, scanned it, and added it to a growing digital folder labeled Karen. I began recording every interaction, saving every email, and documenting the decibel levels of my sheep at various times of day, using a professional sound meter app. I wasn't confrontational by nature. 20 years of legal practice had taught me that preparation, not aggression, wins battles. "I don't like to argue," I told my sister when she suggested I stand up to Karen more directly. "I prefer to prepare." Little did Karen know she had moved against someone who had spent 2 decades navigating corporate contracts and finding loophole skills that would prove far more valuable in our suburban warfare than her ability to intimidate. Over the next 3 months, Karen's campaign against my sheep and me intensified with the strategic precision of a military operation. What began as occasional complaint letters evolved into a multi-pronged assault designed to force me into submission. By month 2, I was receiving formal HOA violation notices on a weekly basis, each one more creatively worded than the last. One particularly memorable notice cited my sheep for emitting biologically unnecessary vocalizations at volumes inconsistent with suburban tranquility. I had to admire the wordsmithing, if nothing else. Karen's next move was medical. At an HOA meeting in June, she dramatically produced a doctor's note claiming she had developed a rare allergy to sheep dander and wool particulates that were supposedly wafting the entire 300 feet from my backyard to her house. The note, written on letterhead from a clinic I later discovered was run by her brother-in-law, recommended the immediate removal of all wool-bearing livestock within a 500-foot radius of patient's residence. When I politely pointed out that sheep dander doesn't travel that far and that several other neighbors had dogs with much more potent allergens without issue, Karen clutched her throat and loudly announced she could feel her airway closing just discussing the animals. Her theatrical performance at HOA meetings reached its peak in August. I arrived at the community center to find Karen had prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled "The Decibel Sheep, a Noise Pollution Crisis in Oak Ridge." The presentation included crude audio recordings that I immediately recognized as having been amplified and manipulated to translate to a foghorn. She had even included spectrograms comparing my sheep's bleating to various urban noises, somehow concluding that 3 sheep were acoustically equivalent to a construction site combined with an airport runway. Through it all, I maintained a calm, almost bemused demeanor. When given the floor to respond, I simply produced my own sound measurements, showing that my sheep rarely exceeded 50 decibels, quieter than normal conversation. For perspective, I told the increasingly uncomfortable HOA board members, Mrs. Westfield's wind chimes register at 65 decibels on a breezy day, and her Saturday morning leaf blower hits about 85 decibels at my property line. My sheep are practically whispering in comparison. Karen's face flushed an alarming shade of red as several neighbors tried to suppress smiles. "The decorative fountain in your Japanese garden actually creates more ambient noise than my entire sheep pen," I added, which earned a few outright chuckles from the audience. By September, Karen had moved beyond HOA channels, making repeated calls to animal control, the police department, and even the health department. Each visit ended the same way, with officials finding no violations and, increasingly, becoming irritated with Karen for wasting their time. After the 4th police visit, one officer pulled me aside. "Look, we know what's happening here. Mrs. Westfield calls us about everything. Kids riding bikes too fast, neighbors barbecuing on the wrong days, someone's mailbox being 2 inches taller than regulation. Just keep documenting everything." I nodded gratefully, adding his badge number and comments to my ever-expanding Karen file. The breaking point came at the September HOA meeting. After all her official channels had failed, Karen stood up during the open comments section and made a declaration that sent a chill down my spine. Her voice was calm but edged with something dark as she looked directly at me across the room. Since it seems our community governance has failed to address this obvious violation of our neighborhood standards, I want everyone to know that I will be taking personal measures to resolve the situation. The room fell silent. Even those who had previously seemed amused by our conflict looked uncomfortable. When the HOA president asked her to clarify what she meant by personal measures, Karen simply smiled and said, "I believe in solving problems directly when the system fails." As she gathered her things to leave, she paused beside my chair and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Those sheep won't be bleating much longer." The atmosphere changed after Karen's thinly veiled threat. The crisp autumn air seemed to carry a tension that hadn't been there before, and I found myself checking on my sheep more frequently throughout the day. I installed additional security cameras around the perimeter of my property. Not the obvious dome cameras that most homeowners use, but discrete models disguised as landscape lighting fixtures, birdhouses, and even a decorative weather vane. The system cost nearly $5,000, but after 20 years of billing corporate clients for comprehensive preventative measures, the expense seemed entirely reasonable. I added motion-activated lights near the sheep pen that would flood the area with illumination if anyone approached after dark, and programmed them to send alerts directly to my phone. I even considered sleeping in the small shed adjacent to their enclosure, going so far as to install insulation, a compact heating system, and a comfortable cot that could serve as a bed during overnight surveillance if necessary. My concerns weren't merely theoretical. Within days of Karen's ominous pronouncement at the HOA meeting, I began noticing subtle but troubling changes in my sheep's behavior. These weren't just animals to me. I had studied their natural behaviors extensively, knew their individual personalities, and could recognize even minor deviations from their normal patterns. Zeus, the largest of the three and typically the most confident, stopped approaching me for his usual morning treats, hanging back behind the others with an uncharacteristic wariness. When I examined him more closely, I discovered small patches of wool missing from his hindquarters, a sign of stress-induced self-barbering that I'd read about but never witnessed in my own animals. Apollo, whose show-quality markings had won him admirers at several livestock exhibitions before I'd purchased him, seemed increasingly jumpy, startling at normal neighborhood sounds that had never bothered him before. The sudden slam of a car door or the rumble of a garbage truck would send him darting to the far corner of the enclosure, eyes wide and nostrils flared. His appetite remained normal, but his usually impeccable coat began looking dull and rough in places where he'd been rubbing against the fencing, another stress response that concerned me. And Hermes, always the most sensitive of the trio and the one I'd hand-raised from his earliest days, began exhibiting the most troubling changes of all. He started refusing his feed occasionally, something he had never done in the past. More alarmingly, I found him one morning standing motionless in the corner of the pen, staring fixedly at Karen's property with his ears pinned back, a posture of fear and defensive alertness that sheep typically reserve for the presence of predators. When I approached to comfort him, he didn't acknowledge me for several long seconds, as if in a trance. When he finally did turn to me, the trust in his eyes had been replaced with something that looked distressingly like suspicion. One morning in early October, I noticed something odd during my routine check. Small white residue around the feeding trough that hadn't been there the night before. The sheep hadn't touched their breakfast, which was highly unusual. Taking a sample of both their feed and the white powder, I sent it to a private laboratory for analysis, not yet willing to make formal accusations without evidence. The preliminary results were disturbing. Traces of a common garden pesticide had been mixed into the feed, not enough to be immediately lethal, but sufficient to make the animals sick over time. I immediately changed their feeding routine, moving their food inside a locked shed and personally supervising every meal. Reviewing the security footage revealed a shadowy figure entering my property shortly after midnight on 3 separate occasions. The person was careful to stay in blind spots between camera angles and wore a hooded sweatshirt that concealed their face. However, on the most recent footage, a distinctive footprint pattern was visible in the soft earth near the gate, the same flower-matted Croc impressions I'd come to recognize. Still, the face remained hidden, and the evidence was circumstantial at best. I needed more. Rather than confront Karen directly, which would only put her on guard, I set a sophisticated trap. First, I rearranged the cameras to cover previous blind spots, while leaving one obvious gap that appeared to be an oversight. Next, I sprinkled a special powder along the most likely entrance path, a powder that was invisible to the naked eye, but would react to a specific chemical spray I kept handy. Most importantly, I installed a particular type of motion-activated dispenser near the sheep pen that would release a fine mist of a harmless but very distinctive perfume, a custom scent I had specially ordered that combined sandalwood and vanilla in a unique proportion. The perfume would cling to clothing and skin for days, even through washing, though it would be subtle enough that the wearer might not notice it on themselves. I also made a very visible show of leaving for a weekend trip, carefully timing my departure for Friday afternoon precisely when Karen was engaged in her ritualistic watering of her front garden, a task she performed with military precision at 4:30 p.m. each day, regardless of weather conditions or actual plant needs. I made multiple trips carrying luggage to my car, making more noise than necessary with the trunk and car doors. I even staged a loud phone conversation on my driveway about looking forward to the conference and being unreachable for the whole weekend. When I caught Karen watching from behind her hydrangeas, I offered a friendly wave before driving away, only to circle back through a neighbor's driveway who was in on my plan, park in their garage, and return to my property through a back gate concealed by mature shrubbery. I had arranged for my sister's husband, David, to come by and turn lights on and off at appropriate times, though the house sitter was actually helping with much more than that. David, a former security consultant for a major bank before retiring to pursue wildlife photography, was as invested in catching Karen as I was. "I've dealt with HOA tyrants before," he had told me grimly when I explained the situation. "They're worse than the corporate embezzlers I used to investigate. At least those people admit they're in it for personal gain." David would be staying in the main house, monitoring the security feeds and providing backup if needed, while I secretly camped out in the now comfortably appointed shed by the sheep pen. The final touch was replacing my 3 prize sheep with realistic decoys, high-quality models used for veterinary training that looked remarkably lifelike from a distance. The decoys had cost nearly $3,000 each, but they were worth every penny for the protection they would provide my actual animals. Made from advanced silicone over articulated frames, they could be positioned in natural poses and even included synthetic wool that matched the distinctive pattern of the Valais black-nose breed. I had spent hours adjusting their positions to match the typical lounging patterns of Zeus, Apollo, and Hermes, even adding small, individualized details like the characteristic way Zeus would rest his head on a particular rock, or how Hermes typically slept curled against Apollo's flank. Meanwhile, my actual animals were already safely ensconced at Meadowbrook Farm, the property of Eleanor Jenkins, a trusted breeder friend whose family had raised championship sheep for 4 generations. Eleanor had been horrified by my account of Karen's threats and had immediately offered sanctuary for my flock. "I've seen what can happen when disturbed individuals target animals," she had said darkly, alluding to incidents in the competitive livestock world that rarely made it into public knowledge. "Your sheep will be safe here, and we'll document their condition before and after to establish a baseline if needed for evidence." The trap was set, and now all I had to do was wait. As dusk fell on Friday night, I settled into my concealed position in the shed, equipped with night vision binoculars, recording equipment, and direct access to the security camera feeds on my tablet. Hours passed. The neighborhood grew quiet as lights went out in surrounding homes. Around 1:30 a.m., my motion sensors pinged an alert to my phone. Someone was approaching the property from the side adjacent to Karen's house. I held my breath and watched. The evidence I gathered that night was damning. Through my night vision binoculars, I clearly observed Karen dressed in dark clothing but wearing her signature flower-matted Crocs, carefully making her way across my property toward the sheep pen. She moved with surprising stealth for someone who made such a show of proper posture at community events, ducking under motion sensor lines and avoiding the most obvious camera placements. In one hand, she carried what appeared to be a plastic bag, and in the other a small garden spade. I recorded every movement as she approached the feeding area, opened the bag to reveal a white powdery substance, and began methodically mixing it into the feed I'd left in the trough. The most chilling moment came when Karen finished contaminating the feed and took a moment to look at my decoy sheep sleeping peacefully in their enclosure. The expression on her face, visible in the infrared camera footage, was one of pure satisfaction. She actually smiled before carefully retracing her steps and disappearing back toward her property. I waited until she was gone before emerging from my hiding spot to collect samples of the contaminated feed and activate the chemical spray that would make the invisible powder trail glow under UV light, documenting a clear path between her back door and my sheep pen. Lab analysis later confirmed what I had suspected. The white powder was a potent herbicide typically used to kill invasive weeds, certainly not something any livestock should consume. At fatal doses, it would cause convulsions, respiratory distress, and ultimately death. Had my real sheep eaten the contaminated feed, they would have suffered terribly before dying. The thought made me physically ill, but it also steeled my resolve for what came next. I waited 3 days before making my move, a strategic decision based on both legal and psychological considerations. The additional time allowed the lab to complete a comprehensive analysis of the toxin, documenting not just its composition but also its concentration and potential sources. More importantly, the delay gave Karen a false sense of security while simultaneously building her anticipations for the results of her action. I had observed this pattern in courtroom opponents who, believing they had successfully buried damaging evidence, would become increasingly confident and ultimately careless. I wanted Karen at her most complacent when I finally confronted her. On the 3rd day, I staged a devastating scene worthy of a crime drama. The decoy sheep positioned to appear dead or dying, with one lying completely motionless on its side, another sprawled with legs akimbo in a position no living sheep would maintain, and the third hunched in a posture suggesting intense pain and imminent collapse. I added realistic details, a dusting of the feed around their mouths, small patches of synthetic wool removed to create the appearance of distress-induced self-harm, and even a carefully concocted mixture of corn syrup and food coloring applied around one decoy's mouth to simulate foaming. The tableau was disturbing, even knowing it wasn't real. Once the scene was set, I began my performance, pacing frantically around the pen, repeatedly running my hands through my hair in apparent distress and making loud, emotional phone calls that could easily be overheard from Karen's property. "They were fine yesterday," I shouted into my phone while standing in the center of my back lawn, where Karen could see me from her kitchen window, which conveniently faced my property. "The vet needs to come now. I don't care what it costs," I continued, my voice cracking with what sounded like genuine anguish. 3 champion Valais black noses don't just collapse simultaneously without cause. As expected, Karen made an appearance within minutes, ostensibly to collect her mail, but actually to witness the fruits of her handiwork. She emerged from her front door with studied casualness, wearing gardening gloves, as if she had been tending to her plants, rather than waiting for signs of her poison's effectiveness. She glanced repeatedly in my direction while pretending to sort through envelopes, her movements becoming increasingly deliberate as she registered the scene unfolding in my backyard. The moment she saw me notice her watching, she quickly retreated inside, but not before I captured her reaction on camera from 3 different angles. A brief but unmistakable smile of triumph that transformed her usually pinched features into something approaching genuine pleasure. That smile, more than any chemical analysis or footprint evidence, revealed the depth of her malice and would prove devastating when viewed by an objective third party. An hour later, I knocked on her door. When she answered, I was accompanied by 2 individuals I introduced as representatives from my insurance company. Her face registered momentary confusion, then alarm, as I calmly explained that I was filing a claim for the loss of my valuable livestock. "What insurance company covers sheep?" she asked, unable to keep the disdain from her voice even in her confusion. "Actually, Karen, the same comprehensive property insurance you insisted all HOA members purchase as part of the amendments you added to the bylaws last year," I replied, watching her expression carefully. "You remember the special rider that covers all valuable property, including specialized landscaping, water features, and any approved livestock or show animals kept on the premises? You were quite insistent that everyone upgrade their policies to include it." Karen's face paled slightly as recognition dawned. Last year, she had indeed pushed through an amendment requiring all homeowners to carry expanded property insurance after her expensive koi pond had been damaged by a neighbor's tree falling during a storm. She'd been outraged when her standard homeowner's policy wouldn't cover the full replacement cost of her imported Japanese koi fish, and had subsequently forced everyone in the neighborhood to increase their coverage to meet her standards. The amendment had passed primarily because Karen had scheduled the vote during summer vacation, when many homeowners were away, and proxy voting was not permitted. "But that was meant for..." She stammered, unable to complete the thought that the policy was only intended to protect her interests, not those of her neighbors. "For valuable property, yes," I continued pleasantly. "And as these documents show, my 3 Valais black-nosed sheep are registered with the International Sheep Breeders Association at a combined value of $75,000, making them some of the most valuable livestock in the county." I handed her a copy of the registration papers along with photographs documenting the sheep's pedigree and show titles. "The policy you mandated we all purchase specifically includes coverage for deliberate damage caused by neighbors, with triple damages for cases involving intentional animal cruelty." As the blood drained from Karen's face, I delivered the final blow. "Oh, and the insurance company has already been provided with the evidence collected over the past several months, including the security footage from last Friday night showing you poisoning my sheep's feed. They'll be pursuing full restitution, of course, as well as referring the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal charges." I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice gentle but firm. "One more thing you should know, Karen. The sheep you poisoned on Friday night, they were high-quality decoys. My actual champions are perfectly fine, staying with a breeder friend." I smiled at her shocked expression, "But the policy still covers the attempted crime. The insurance company is particularly interested in the premeditation aspect. All those HOA complaints you filed creating a paper trail of your escalating hostility toward my animals. They've never seen such thorough documentation of intent." As I turned to leave, Karen found her voice again. You tricked me? You can't prove anything?" Her hands were shaking as she clutched the doorframe for support. "I didn't trick you into trespassing on my property at 2 a.m. or mixing poison into my animal's food, Karen," I replied calmly. "I just made sure there would be consequences for your actions. The insurance company will be in touch to discuss settlement options. I suggest you find a good lawyer." The conference room at the insurance company's regional office felt more like a courtroom than a place for a routine claims discussion. On one side of the long mahogany table sat Karen and her attorney, a pinch-faced man named Gerald Hoffman, who specialized in real estate law and clearly looked uncomfortable handling what had evolved into a potential criminal matter. On the other side sat myself, my insurance claims adjuster Monica Jenkins, and the company's legal counsel Sarah Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman whose reputation for ruthless efficiency in fraud cases had earned her the nickname the Barracuda among her peers. Karen had rejected the initial settlement offer, insisting that the whole situation was a misunderstanding and demanding we meet in person. She clearly believed that her standing in the community and her brother-in-law's connections would somehow make this all go away. The smug expression she wore as we entered the room suggested she thought this meeting was a formality, perhaps even an opportunity for me to apologize for the confusion. That expression began to fade as Monica methodically laid out the evidence we had compiled over the previous 6 months. "Let's begin with the documented pattern of harassment. Monica said, sliding a thick folder across the table. 47 separate HOA complaints filed by Mrs. Westfield regarding Mr. Marshall's sheep, all of which were investigated and dismissed. 12 calls to local police and animal control, similarly dismissed. 4 separate instances where Mrs. Westfield distributed flyers to neighbors containing false information about health risks posed by sheep in residential areas. And most concerning, this recording from the September HOA meeting where Mrs. Westfield explicitly threatens to take personal measures after official channels failed to remove the animals. Karen's attorney attempted to interject with claims about selective evidence and context, but Monica continued undeterred. Now let's move to the physical evidence. Security footage showing a person matching Mrs. Westfield's height and build entering Mr. Marshall's property on 3 separate occasions in October, including the night of the poisoning incident. Soil samples from a path leading directly from Mrs. Westfield's back gate to Mr. Marshall's sheep pen, containing chemical traces matching the herbicide found in the contaminated feed, and, perhaps most damning, the distinctive footprint pattern matching Mrs. Westfield's custom-ordered Crocs. A pattern we've confirmed is not sold in any retail store and was special ordered through the manufacturer's design program. Karen's face had grown increasingly pale as Monica spoke, but she maintained her composure until Sarah placed a small evidence bag on the table containing a fabric swatch. This sample was taken from clothing found in Mrs. Westfield's outdoor trash bin 2 days after the incident. It contains traces of a unique scent compound, a proprietary blend that Mr. Marshall had installed as an additional security measure around his property. The compound is designed to be invisible and odorless to the wearer, but contains markers that can be detected by specialized equipment. This particular compound was created specifically for this situation and exists nowhere else. Karen's attorney looked increasingly concerned, whispering urgently to his client before addressing the room. While these circumstantial pieces might suggest my client was in the vicinity, there's no direct evidence showing Mrs. Westfield actually tampering with any animal feed. This could all be explained by Mrs. Westfield perhaps investigating strange noises or checking for covenant violations, which is within her rights as HOA president. At this point, Sarah nodded to Monica, who connected her laptop to the room's display screen. "Actually, we do have direct evidence of the tampering itself," she said, queuing up a video file. The footage showed clear infrared images of Karen approaching the feeding trough, removing a bag of white powder from her pocket and methodically mixing it into the feed. The camera angle captured her face in perfect detail as she looked up to check if anyone was watching, then gazed at the sleeping sheep with an expression of satisfaction. That's not what it looks like," Karen blurted, speaking for the first time since the evidence presentation began. "I was just checking the quality of the feed. I've heard some brands can be harmful to animals." Her attorney closed his eyes briefly, clearly pained by his client's improvised defense. "The white substance you're seen adding to the feed tested positive for concentrated glyphosate herbicide," Monica countered, "at levels approximately 20 times the lethal dose for an animal of that size. We also have the receipt from your purchase of this exact herbicide from Garden World 3 days prior to the incident, paid for with your credit card." Karen's demeanor suddenly shifted from defensive to offensive, a tactical change I had witnessed many times during HOA confrontations when she felt cornered. "This is ridiculous. It was just baking powder. I was trying to help the animals digest their food better. I read online that baking soda can help with sheep digestion issues. I was being neighborly." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression one of professional curiosity rather than judgment. "Baking powder that laboratory analysis identified as commercial-grade herbicide? Baking powder that you applied while trespassing at 2 a.m.? Baking powder that you purchased in concentrated form from a garden supply store rather than a grocery store? That's an interesting definition of neighborly, Mrs. Westfield." Karen's attorney finally intervened, requesting a brief recess to confer with his client. When they returned 15 minutes later, the attorney's expression was grave. "My client would like to revisit the settlement offer," he said quietly. We believe an amicable resolution without further escalation would be in everyone's best interest. As the meeting concluded with discussions of financial terms and non-disclosure agreements, Karen avoided making eye contact with anyone. Her carefully constructed facade had crumbled, revealing the truth behind her polished HOA president persona. As we gathered our materials to leave, she finally looked directly at me, her expression a mixture of defeat and lingering resentment. "You've ruined me," she whispered, just loudly enough for me to hear. "I was protecting our neighborhood's values." I considered her words carefully before responding. "No, Karen. You poisoned innocent animals because they occasionally made noise during the day. There's a difference between enforcing reasonable community standards and what you did. The sheep were never the real problem. Your need for control was..." The settlement was substantial, $150,000 for attempted destruction of valuable property, potential breeding income loss, emotional distress, and punitive damages. The insurance company, having documented Karen's actions thoroughly, recovered the full amount directly from her rather than distributing the cost across other policyholders. The terms included Karen's immediate resignation from the HOA board and a legally binding agreement to sell her house and move from the neighborhood within 6 months. She was also prohibited from serving on any HOA board for 10 years. Criminal charges were ultimately not pursued after consultation with the district attorney, who felt the civil penalties were sufficient. In the weeks following the settlement, a remarkable transformation swept through Oak Ridge Estates. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves began to emerge, sharing stories of their own encounters with Karen's excessive enforcement. The interim HOA board discovered that numerous architectural and landscaping requests had been arbitrarily denied over the years, based on Karen's personal preferences rather than actual bylaw violations. I used a portion of the settlement to construct a state-of-the-art sheep enclosure with excellent soundproofing features, climate control, and automated feeding systems. The new structure included a small viewing area where interested neighbors could observe the animals safely. What had begun as a private hobby evolved into a small-scale educational opportunity, with occasional weekend open houses where people could learn about these unique animals. Karen's house sold quickly, purchased by a young couple with dreams of establishing a small butterfly garden that would have never survived her scrutiny. On her moving day, I made a point of being outside with my sheep. Zeus, the largest of my Valais blacknoses, let out an especially loud bleat just as Karen was carrying her prized crystal vase to the car. She flinched and shot me a venomous glare that quickly dissolved into resignation when she saw my calm smile. The most satisfying outcome wasn't the money or seeing Karen leave the neighborhood. It was the community that emerged in her absence. The following spring, Oak Ridge Estates held its first neighborhood picnic in over 5 years. Children played on front lawns that Karen had previously deemed too visible for recreational use. Gardens bloomed with varieties once forbidden for being non-standard. My sheep received treats and gentle pats from neighbors who had previously been too intimidated by Karen to approach my property. On pleasant evenings, I sometimes sit on my back porch with a glass of wine, watching my sheep graze peacefully. The new HOA president asked if I would consider serving on the board's Community Engagement Committee, noting that my attention to detail and documentation skills would be valuable assets. As for the infamous flower-mattened Crocs that had left such damning evidence, I keep them in a shadow box on my office wall as a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't require confrontation or aggression. Sometimes it simply requires patience, preparation, and a willingness to play the long game. I may not be good at direct confrontation, but if you want to play by the rules with me, you'd better make sure you've read the fine print. Justice, like a well-tended flock, requires vigilance, care, and occasionally a bit of strategic thinking. My sheep continue to bleat their gentle morning songs, but these days, it's me who has the last laugh.